All right, so today we are in Los Angeles on the UCLA campus. We have the great pleasure to meet with Jason Nuncio Dorio, who is a lecturer at the Graduate School of Education and Informational Studies at UCLA, and also former Director of Academic Programs, UNESCO UCLA Chair in Global Learning and Global Citizenship Education. Very welcome to
Thank
Global Citizenship Education Interview Series to Jason Dorio.
Thank you for having me.
So it's a pleasure to be with you, and before this interview we had lovely discussions around the notion of global citizenship and global citizenship education. And I'd like to start with a straightforward question. What is global citizenship and what is global citizenship education in your opinion?
My understanding and kind of my practice of global citizenship education and the courses at UCLA that I've taught has a few levels. The first level, global citizenship education, I see should be about enhancing or extending knowledge that is grounded in the way globalization impacts local communities, the way local communities respond to different forms of globalization, and the way they, including resistance and recreating globalization in their own understandings and in their own needs.
Right.
On a second level, there's an expansion of identity. So James Banks talks about global identities and the relationship between local and national identities,
right.
And he calls it the delicate balance. So I see at that level, global citizenship education should be expanding students' identity and connecting to global communities.
Right.
Another level of global citizenship education is looking or expanding an empathy, a consciousness for diversity that can be connected to your own humanity. So understanding about the histories of other people, understanding about the struggles of other people that are different than you. And the last level of global citizenship education is looking at action.
Right.
So what do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with this empathy? What do we do with these identities? How do we help transform local environments with a more global world conscious?
Right. Right.
So those are kind of the four levels that I see global citizenship education, and that also would overlap to some sort of definition of global citizenship.
Right. Right.
I think once you define something, which humans love to define and categorize, I think you exclude.
Sure.
So another way of identifying global citizenship education that I've kind of written about and been thinking about is what global citizenship education is not.
Right. Right.
So I see what global citizenship education is not, or what it should be struggling against, on kind of three levels. The first level is global citizenship education should not mimic what Paulo Freire talks about banking education or authoritarian types of education.
Right.
It's not about measuring the type of education.
And I will ask you a question on that next.
It's not about having preset standards of what global citizenship education is. It's not about controlling knowledge for the benefit of a few people. The second kind of goal or direction that global citizenship education should attempt to address is neoliberal citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So for the past 30 years, numerous scholars have analyzed the impacts of neoliberal globalization, not only in economic policies, but how it has infiltrated a culture of education policy.
Right, right.
So focusing on, again, assessment, focusing on skills that would be to provide access to the global economy, focusing on competitiveness,
right,
between students or across universities, and with those policies, what the culture of neoliberal education does is, I think, it creates passive citizens.
Right, right.
It creates citizens that are uncritical about the world. It creates citizens that are more worried about the ability to buy something than the ability to change the world.
Right.
So what it means to be a good citizen has been misconstrued into good citizens are good consumers.
Right, right, right.
I think that's very problematic for global citizenship education.
Right.
And I think neoliberal education policies can really shape the way global citizenship education is designed in programs and taught in classes,
right,
whether at the school level or university level. The last challenge, or the last phenomena that I think global citizenship education should address, or what global citizenship education is not, is this return to nationalist populism.
Right.
I think critical or transformative model of global citizenship education, wherever it exists, should address toxic notions of patriotism or hateful xenophobic movements that are currently persuading our politicians and persuading our public.
Right, right.
For global citizenship education to have any type of meaning in society, to provide any type of quality, I think it must explain how globalization impacts and disenfranchise people, but also how globalization can bring people together to address these challenges.
Right, right.
Which I think is one of the problems why these movements, these nationalist, populist, and extreme right-wing movements have increased, because society hasn't offered an explanation to the problems, to the discontents of globalization. Right. So sometimes I like to look at global citizenship education in that, like what are those main challenges that it's trying to address. So.
Interesting. But I find interesting that you're defining what a GC is not. It's a good approach to really analyze this notion. What is a global citizen? Trying to respond this question really in three key words. I know that all faculties, researchers have been interviewing here in this interview series on GC find this question pretty hard to answer, but it's always nice to know, what are the core notion according to you.
From a researcher's perspective, it's easier to analyze.
Yeah, sure. Then, of course, when it comes to in-class implementation, it's much harder. But it's still interesting to know your response on this.
How about 4 words?
Yeah, 4 is also fine, absolutely.
There's elements of eco pedagogy in global citizenship education. There's elements of human rights. There's elements of indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdoms. There's elements of social justice education.
Right.
There's elements of critical technology understandings. And those are kind of the themes that I shape my courses around.
Well, this is this in a way really respond the question. I mean, the notion of eco pedagogy is really, I think, important. For example, this morning when I was presenting in your class, and the questions that came from the students are really connected to whether we are sort of anthropocentric or we should, respect other living beings too. So there is this interconnectedness that it's not only human-centered, but it should look into other, should aim at respecting other living beings, right? So I think that's new, to me in a way that was brought in a discussion this morning, and you're saying now, repeating now. All right, so this ties in a way to what you were saying before. You were talking about assessment, assessing, and this in a way reminds me to the notion, the highly debated notion of global competency. So what do you think about the notion of global competency? How would you address a discussion around this notion? What is your experience with in more general terms in assessing how your students are learning notions that are connected to and with global citizenship?
So to begin with, the notion of measuring and assessing and quality assurance based on those measurements and assessment, I think ties into neoliberal educational global models. The funding, the value is placed on those subjects that are thought to be measurable, and it's connected to production. But I think once you focus learning on measuring, you narrow the ability of the program or the teaching and the learner. You really narrow the possibilities that can occur from a type of learning.
Right.
And with something like global citizenship education, from the programs and teaching that I am familiar with on my own and other people, it's such a rich, people bring in so many different topics.
Right.
And it's so many different lenses, and you're looking at so many different relationships. How can you measure the impact that has on the student even after a year, let alone a semester? That impact might not be felt or acted out until sometime, like years later. Something might click in a student, they experience something and they relate it to a topic, a discussion, an argument, a debate, a reading that happened in that classroom,
right.
And then it clicks. And then maybe they engage or act out that global citizenship. Yeah. But how can you devise a test to measure that? A box checking yes or no, whether they fit global citizenship or not. Another thing is, as soon as you devise a test, you're limiting all the other experiences that a global citizenship education course can have. So, and in designing this measurement, you would have to do a pre-assessment and post-assessment to see where they're coming in with, and then what they're leaving with. But a lot of these assessments are predefined somewhere else in a different cultural context.
Sure.
So what's important with regards to global citizenship education in one location of the world is maybe not necessarily important in another location of the world. So if we had to measure any type of global citizenship education, or any type of education for that matter, I like to use the approach of having students design their own assessment tool.
Right, sure.
They put in the value system, because it's their values that we're testing anyways. They put in what's important, they leave out what's not important. They, what you wanted a multiple choice test, you wanted an essay, you wanted project-based. They design it. And I think if we have to measure global citizenship education, which I would strongly argue against, because it's detrimental to the whole notion of global a critical understanding of global citizenship education to begin with, I would say have the students.
So
design
it should be student-centered. This is an interesting approach. So having the students planning, discussing what is most important to be included in the test, having them to create the questions, choosing the way of expressing how they feel about the notion, and then that should be probably assessed all along a semester, academic semester, and so on.
So it would be it would take a long time to plan it.
Interesting.
What I do for my students in my global citizenship education classroom, the assessments that I use, I kind of take nods from Paulo Freire's idea of problem-posing education.
Mm-hmm.
So the first assignment that I have them work on, this is before any type of intervention on my part, and they present this throughout the year, is they have to answer a question of what is the biggest challenge facing humanity and our planet. And it's a short research project, 5 pages. These are undergrad students from multiple disciplines. It's kind of they come from all parts of the campus, social science and hard sciences. But they answer the question, what is the biggest challenge facing humanity and the planet? What are some of the causes of this challenge? What populations or who does it affect, or what does it affect? What are some of the innovative ways people are addressing this challenge? And then connecting it to their own lived experience, because I think it's very important for global citizenship education, is what can UCLA students do to address this challenge? So they're coming up practical solutions and reflecting upon their own role in this challenge.
Wonderful, interesting.
So the second big project is in groups, the students develop a 5-day unit plan on a level of student that they want. In this unit plan, some of the criteria are that they have to address at least 2 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they have to describe the population that they want to teach.
Right.
Because I'm a big believer in you have to address the issues, and you have to connect the learning in the classroom with students' reality outside of the classroom. And that's one level of engaged students. So they have to describe that. They have to somehow define global citizenship education, which is contradictory because I'm not defining it, but I want my students to define it.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because you bring in a lot of different perspectives from the students themselves. So that's really valuable.
And they have to have some component of civic engagement.
Right.
So I think the tension with teaching citizenship education or citizenship education in general is do you have to travel to be a global citizen? And do you have to, does action driven by global citizenship or global citizenship education has to be directed to a community outside your own community?
Right.
Where I would say no to both.
Right.
Traveling is very important. Experience other cultures outside the country or outside your community is very important.
Right.
But
it's an element. Yeah, sure.
There's a lot of people in this country and a lot of other privileged countries that look to address social issues beyond their borders. But within their borders, they have a number of social issues. And I don't know, why don't you want to address those issues within your borders as well as outside of your borders?
Sure.
So global citizenship education can have that role. It could be a way of engaging your local community while connecting it to global issues across the world. So I have that element of a civic engagement project in there.
Interesting.
But contradictory, I don't have a civic engagement assignment per se in my class.
Right.
I mean, we argue about what should be the role and what should be the actions of global citizens, and we debate about levels of action.
Right.
But because it's a 10-week course, there's a lot of unpacking and a lot of buildup you need for those community engagement projects. So I think if the course was designed as a year-long course, I think I would be more willing to do it. I just don't want to, I wouldn't want to rush a civic engagement project.
Right.
But on the other hand, I would argue that that lesson plan, they leave the class with a 5-day lesson plan that they could teach in that desired community or build upon and teach wherever they want.
Interesting.
And the assignment of the global challenges, they're identifying actions that UCLA students can do.
Right.
So if they want, they could follow that plan with their own student communities or with their own communities at home.
Right, which is very interesting. And here we're going toward the conclusion of this interview. And one question I'd like to ask you is, what is your experience with your students in terms of concrete changes or transformation, either in their approach to society in general, their own lives, while learning notions of global citizenship and principles of global awareness through your classes, your teachings?
So I had 26 students in my last Global Citizenship Education class. I still keep in contact with about 5 students.
Right.
So it's hard to keep track what my students are doing after the class.
Right.
But I think that would be an important part of the research. The students that I'm keeping in contact with, and they come to me with advice. They have been, I don't want to say inspired only by the class, but they have been driven to participate in any way that they see as beneficial to giving back to society. Right. An important issue that we discussed in class was privilege.
Right.
In any university, regardless of where it is, usually the students in that space are privileged in that society,
right,
or they're privileged globally.
Right.
So an important topic that a running theme throughout the quarter was, what are you going to do with that privilege? I mean, we all have various sources of privilege based on race, class, gender, nationality, but attempting to realize that privilege and enacting the powers that you're given because of that privilege, I think that's a key component
absolutely
of global citizenship education. So some students said that before the class they didn't really have time to volunteer, and after the class they were more driven. So some of them volunteered in community groups. One specifically was teaching, it was like after school programs,
right,
in urban areas in LA, and a lot of the youth that she was working with were undocumented, which is a huge issue in the U.S. currently. So what she was doing is not only kind of building a connection between youth, especially like Latino and Black youth.
Right.
There's a big tension in LA between a lot of the youth groups. But so she was fostering kind of connectivity between the groups, but she would also help them navigate going in and out, like being kicked out of school, and maybe being in juvenile hall for youth under 18.
Right. So you kind of addressing a practical experience of one of your students that as a result of your teachings and a series of elements around her life, then decided to dedicate her life to supporting communities in need.
See, I don't know if it was a direct relation.
Right.
I would like to think, and all teachers I think would like to think that they have some impact on the student life, but that's I think gets at one of the issues of measurement.
Right.
And I didn't do any type of evaluation of what the students came into class.
Right.
They did share with me that I challenged their understanding of the world.
Right.
I challenged their assumptions and stereotypes about certain people, groups, and countries. Not me, but the classes, or their colleagues or the readings.
Right.
So I think to have like a proper reflection, I would have to see where they were before. I mean, there was strong comments like students made and comments such as, I never thought about the connection between education and politics before,
right.
or connection between knowledge and power, which was a key element in the course. Or they said that the course challenged their preconceived Western American centric views.
Right.
So there's little comments like that. A lot of students, they came to the class not. So I did ask, why did you enroll in this class?
Right.
And everyone said, the course sounds interesting, the title of the course sounds interesting, but I don't have any idea what global citizenship education is.
So in a way, they got in the class without having a foundation of knowledge around the notion. But then, as you say just before, in the process of taking the course, they could make some connections between certain notions, for example, democracy and power, or globalization, and the inequalities that this notion brings with it. All right, and to conclude, just before the interview, you were mentioning a very interesting point about the 3-4 areas that, in a way, you believe are strongly connected with what we discussed today and the work you're doing in the classroom as it relates to global citizenship and global citizenship education. Can you share with us what are these areas and why are they crucially important in your opinion?
So the way I conceive and try and teach and design the global citizenship education courses are around 3 levels. Expanding knowledge. So expanding knowledge about how globalization impacts your life.
Right.
But also expanding knowledge of how it impacts other communities.
Right.
And expanding knowledge about the most disenfranchised people in society.
Right.
Second level is expanding responsibilities. Expanding the responsibilities to some people just getting outside of the house and doing something with, like, again, that privilege, or something bigger and broader, maybe sacrificing sacrificing for a greater cause. The third level is expanding identity.
Right.
So being connected to something larger than your immediate cultural groups, or connecting the struggles of your cultural groups with another cultural groups, but being aware of that connection.
Right.
And these are overlapping and interconnected. They're not mutually exclusive. So the last point is expanding your actions, expanding your engagement, which I think is connected to expanding your responsibilities, because Oxfam, in some of their early writings of global citizenship education, they called for an indignation for social inequalities.
Right.
So that action has to be driven by some sort of indignation.
Right.
So another point of the class was trying to blend social and environmental injustices.
Right.
So I would say it would be a combination of those 4 levels.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was very interesting. I really thank you, Dr. Jason Dorio, for participating in this interview, and Thank you so much. It was a pleasure discussing with you global citizenship education, global citizenship, and all the notion that are rotating around the concept.
Thank you, my pleasure.